The night before Mother's Day, my own mother deleted me like spam and told the family, all my successful kids except Ingrid. For years later, the governor called my name on stage, and she showed up uninvited, smiling for cameras, until one sentence froze the room and made her disappear. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Ingrid Fairbanks Webb, and I'm 34 years old, and I need you to understand something right up front because people love to pretend they don't know how cruelty works when it's wrapped in pearls and polite smiles. My mother didn't slap me. She didn't scream at me. She didn't even have the decency to fight with me. She did something cleaner. Something rich people do when they want you gone but don't want the mess on their carpet. She edited me out. She removed me from my own family, like I was a typo. Like my name was an inconvenience. And the wild part is, she thought she could do that and still claim me later when it looked good on camera. That's what this story is really about. Not teaching. Not awards. Not success. It's about what happens when someone treats love like a membership card and you finally cancel the subscription. 4 years ago, the night before Mother's Day, I was sitting on my couch in my tiny studio apartment with lesson plans spread across the coffee table, red pen uncapped, the smell of cheap chamomile tea in the air, and I was feeling peaceful. Not happy, not sad, just that quiet kind of tired teachers carry around like a second spine. You know the feeling, when you've given your whole day away to other people's children and you're trying to stitch yourself back together with silence. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. and I almost ignored it because nothing good starts that late, but then I saw Rachel's name. Cousin Rachel. The only person in my family who still talked to me like I was human and not a failed stock investment. When I answered, she didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was. She just said my name like it hurt her mouth. Ingrid, I need to tell you something. Her voice was shaking like she was about to confess a crime, and in a way, she was. What happened? I asked, already sitting up, already feeling that cold little drop in my stomach like an elevator cable snapping. She whispered, check WhatsApp. I opened the app, half annoyed, half confused, and my thumb hovered over the family group chat. Fairbanks family dinner. The one my mother created so she could control holidays like a CEO controls a board meeting. Only it wasn't there. The chat was gone from my list like it had never existed. I thought my app glitched. I thought maybe my Wi-Fi was acting up. So I searched the name. Nothing. I said, Rachel, what do you mean check WhatsApp? I don't see. She cut me off. They removed you. I'm so sorry. Your mom asked Victoria to do it last week. She did it tonight. I took screenshots. I'm sending them. My phone buzzed again. One screenshot, then another, and I stared at my screen, and the room went silent in a way that wasn't normal silence, more like your body shuts off sound because it can't handle what it's seeing. The message was from my mother, Margaret Fairbanks, posted in the family group chat at 8:32 p.m. Like she was posting a schedule update. Like she was announcing brunch reservations. Reminder, Mother's Day dinner at the Jefferson. 7 p.m. sharp. All my children will be there. All my successful children. Ingrid chose to be a lowly teacher. I no longer see her as my daughter. Please don't mention her name tomorrow. I read it once and didn't breathe. I read it twice and my hands went numb. I read it again and my brain tried to do that thing where it negotiates with reality. Maybe she didn't mean it like that. Maybe it's a joke. Maybe she's drunk. Maybe this is out of context. And then I saw the replies. Victoria, my sister, the plastic surgeon, responded with a heart emoji. A heart. Not a mom stop. Not a that's cruel. A heart. Like she was liking a photo of a handbag. Bradley, my brother, the corporate lawyer, responded. Understood, Mom. 2 words. That's all I got. Understood. Mom. Like I was an item on a checklist. Like I was a policy change. Rachel sent one more screenshot, and it was worse because it wasn't dramatic, it was casual. It was them continuing to plan dinner, like I wasn't a person. Like my absence was the new seating arrangement. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in my hands, staring at those words until my eyes burned, and the strange part is I didn't cry. I wanted to. I felt like I should. But my body went into this quiet shutdown mode where it stops giving you tears and starts giving you decisions. I asked Rachel, why are you telling me? And she said, because you're my family, even if they've decided you're not theirs. That sentence cracked something open, not in a cheesy way, but in a practical way. Like, okay, so this is what it is. No more guessing. No more hoping. No more chasing crumbs. I saved those screenshots in a folder and I titled it Proof because I knew, deep down, that one day someone would try to rewrite this. Someone would try to say I imagined it. Someone would try to paint me as dramatic. People like my mother don't just hurt you, they also prepare the courtroom in advance. They get their narrative ready. So I saved everything. And then I did the one thing that shocked even me. I didn't call her. I didn't text. I didn't show up at the Jefferson to beg for a seat at the table. I didn't give her the performance she expected, because people like her don't just want obedience, they want emotion. They want you crying, pleading, reacting because it proves they still own you. Instead, I disappeared. Completely. I blocked her number. Then Victoria's. Then Bradley's. I deleted Instagram so I wouldn't accidentally see their perfect family photos and punish myself with them like it was discipline. And on Mother's Day morning, I woke up to silence. No, Happy Mother's Day. No, we miss you. No awkward pity texts. Nothing. It was like I had died, and they were relieved because now the family brand was cleaner. So I made coffee. I graded papers. I went for a walk along the creek behind my apartment complex and watched the sun catch the water, and I thought, this is what it feels like to be disowned without anyone saying it to your face. It's not a dramatic explosion. It's a quiet deletion. And if you've ever been deleted by people who swore they loved you, you know it messes with your head because there's no closure. There's just absence. The next months were a slow, humiliating education in how exclusion works when it's dressed up as, we're just busy. It didn't happen all at once. It had been building for years. That WhatsApp message wasn't the beginning. It was the final signature on a contract they'd been drafting since I was a teenager. In my family, love was a trophy. You were loved when you made them look good. Victoria was the crown jewel. She became surgeon, and my mother wore that like jewelry. Bradley became a lawyer, and my mother treated that like a shield. And me? I became a teacher. A fourth-grade teacher at Maple Creek Elementary, about 90 miles from my mother's pristine colonial revival house in a suburb where everybody pretends they're old money because they joined a country club and learned how to say summer like it's a verb. I didn't choose teaching because I couldn't do anything else. I had a 4.1 GPA. I had a full scholarship for pre-med at UVA. My mother had already told her friends. She had already ordered the bumper sticker. My daughter's going to be a doctor. That was the story she wanted. But that summer, I volunteered at a literacy camp for underprivileged kids, and there was this boy, Marcus Jr., 8 years old, who couldn't read past a first-grade level. He'd been told he was slow. He'd been treated like a problem. And for weeks I sat with him, day after day, sounding out words, breaking down sentences, watching his eyes do that thing where you can see someone's mind grabbing onto hope for the first time. And when he finished Charlotte's Web on his own, he hugged me so hard I thought my ribs would crack. That moment changed me. It wasn't inspirational, it was immediate, like a switch flipped. So I called my mother and told her I was declining pre-med. I was going to study education. I can still remember the silence. 17 seconds. I counted. Then she said, "You're throwing your life away." Not, "Are you sure?" Not, "Tell me why." Just judgment. Like I had embarrassed her in public. She didn't come to my college graduation. Said she had a conflict. A garden party at the club. Victoria sent a card with a $50 check and wrote, "Good luck with your little career." I cashed it because groceries don't accept pride as payment, but I never forgot what it meant. You chose wrong, so you deserve less. And the older I got, the more obvious it became that my mother treated my siblings like investments and treated me like a loss she wanted off the books. Thanksgiving 2019, I showed up with homemade sweet potato casserole, the recipe my grandmother used to make, and my place card wasn't at the main table. It was at the folding table in the corner, where the stepkids sat, where the toddlers sat, where the extra people sat. My mother adjusted her pearl earrings and smiled like this was a compliment. "Oh, honey, we ran out of room at the main table. You don't mind, do you? You're so good with children." I was 30. But I sat there anyway because I had spent my whole life being trained to accept scraps and call it loyalty. Christmas was worse. I knitted her a cashmere scarf in her favorite shade of dove gray. 3 weeks of work, my hands aching because I wanted so badly to be seen. When she opened it, she held it up, smiled thinly, and said, "How handmade." Then she turned to Victoria's gift, a Chanel clutch, and spent 20 minutes praising the stitching, the hardware, the craftsmanship like she was reviewing a luxury car. My scarf ended up in the coat closet. I found it 2 months later still wrapped in tissue paper, tags I'd removed shoved back inside like it had been returned to the universe. And then on her birthday in early 2020, I called to ask what time dinner was and she said, "Oh, Ingrid, the restaurant only had 6 seats available. 6 seats for my father, Victoria, Bradley, their spouses, and my mother. And somehow the only person cut was me." She said, "You understand, don't you? Family comes first." I remember staring at the wall after that call thinking, what am I then? A neighbor? A charity case? A mistake they won't admit? So, when the WhatsApp message arrived, it didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the first time she said out loud what she'd been saying with actions for years. I spent that first night reading the screenshots over and over, not because I didn't understand, but because my brain kept searching for a hidden door, a loophole, something to soften it. There wasn't one. And then the next day, the world did what the world does. Kids still needed their spelling tests graded. Parents still emailed about homework. The school secretary still asked if I could cover someone's recess duty. Life didn't pause because my mother decided I wasn't her daughter anymore. And that's the part people don't talk about. Betrayal doesn't stop the clock. It just poisons the hours. 6 months later, Rachel called again and said, "Thanksgiving photos are up." I told her I didn't want to see them. I lasted 3 hours. The photo showed my mother at the head of the table, flanked by Victoria and Bradley, crystal stemware catching light, a turkey centerpiece like a magazine spread. The caption said, "Grateful for my amazing family. Mom, you raised us right." And the table was arranged like it had always been that way. No empty chair. No gap. No hint that a daughter existed and was missing. They didn't just exclude me. They reconfigured the story so my absence looked natural. And that's when it hit me. My mother wasn't just rejecting me. She was erasing evidence that I'd ever challenged her narrative. And here's the twisted part. She started lying about me to other people, but in a way that protected her image. Rachel told me my mom was telling country club friends I was doing volunteer work in Africa for an education nonprofit. Prestigious. Unreachable. Heroic. I laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was sick. She couldn't admit she disowned her daughter for being a teacher, so she invented a version of me she could brag about. A humanitarian she could name drop at brunch while the real me was sitting in Virginia, eating ramen, grading papers, trying not to fall apart. That lie told me everything. My mother didn't hate me because I was a failure. She hated me because my existence threatened her brand. So she replaced me with a fictional version she could control. And if you're still listening right now, I want to pause and ask you something because I already know this story is hitting a nerve for people who've lived it. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments, because I want to see how far this reaches, and I want you to know you're not alone in whatever city you're sitting in with that same tight feeling in your chest. Now here's where things start shifting, and not in a revenge fantasy way, but in a real-life way where the smallest moments become the start of a whole new future. Because while my mother was busy deleting me, I was still living. I was still teaching. I was still building a life she wasn't invited into, even though I didn't fully understand yet that it would become the very thing she would later try to claim. I met Marcus Webb on a Tuesday in October, surrounded by pumpkins and giggling 9-year-olds. His farm, Webb Family Organics, was where our school took field trips every fall. 50 acres of rolling hills, a red barn, rows of heritage vegetables, apple trees that made kids feel like they were inside a picture book. My 4th graders were bouncing off the bus like popcorn, and I was trying to wrangle them into a line when Marcus walked over. Tall, broad-shouldered, kind eyes, hands that looked like they belonged to the earth. He shook my hand and said, "You must be Miss Fairbanks. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about you." His daughter, Lily, was 5, golden curls, a smile that could melt the hardest day. She was in my colleague's kindergarten class, but I tutored her twice a week because her mother had died the year before. Cancer. The kind of loss that makes a house too quiet. Marcus looked at me like he didn't know how to say thank you without breaking. I told him Lily was brilliant. Curious. Stubborn in the best way. He smiled, but his eyes watered. He said, "She says you're her favorite teacher in the whole school, even though you're not technically her teacher." That sentence did something to me. Because I had spent my whole life being told my worth was measured by titles and salaries, and here was a child measuring worth by presence. By showing up. The field trip turned into a phone call later that week. He asked if I could recommend books for Lily. The phone call turned into coffee. Coffee turned into a picnic under an old oak tree on his property where he asked about my family, and I said the truth without drama, without details, just a simple fact that felt like a bruise. "I don't have one," I said. Or, "They decided they don't have me." He didn't react with pity. He didn't ask invasive questions. He just handed me a slice of apple pie his late wife's mother had taught him to make and said, "Family isn't always blood, Ingrid. Sometimes it's the people who show up when everyone else leaves." I wanted to believe him so badly it almost scared me, because hope after betrayal feels like stepping onto ice you don't trust. Over the next year, Marcus became this quiet constant. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of person who doesn't say, "I'm here for you" as a performance, but proves it in small ways, like bringing extra vegetables from the farm when he knew money was tight, or showing up at my school fundraiser without being asked, or remembering the names of my students because he listened when I talked about them. And while my mother was pretending I was overseas, Marcus was watching me in real time. Watching me struggle, watching me keep going anyway, watching me become someone without any applause. That mattered. Because by then, I had stopped craving their approval. I didn't even know I had until I felt what it was like to be valued without conditions. But I'm going to be honest with you. Even with Marcus, even with the farm air and Lily's little laughter and the slow rebuilding, there were nights I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I was the problem. That's the poison of family rejection. Even when you know it's wrong, your brain still tries to blame you because blaming yourself gives you the illusion of control. If it's my fault, then I can fix it. If it's their cruelty, then I can't. And that's terrifying. So I kept my head down. I worked. I taught. I poured myself into my classroom like it was a sanctuary. I started taking night classes for my master's degree in educational leadership, typing papers at 11 p.m. with my eyes burning, because if my family was going to treat me like I was lowly, then I was going to become so undeniable they'd choke on it. Not for them, for me. For the girl who sat at the folding table pretending it didn't hurt. For the woman who read that WhatsApp message 47 times, looking for a loophole. I didn't know yet how big my life was going to get, and I definitely didn't know my mother would try to step back into it like she owned the stage. But the first clue came in the form of a simple truth that hit me like a slap. When people erase you, they don't expect you to become visible without them. They expect you to collapse. They expect you to beg. They expect you to come crawling back for permission to exist. And the moment you don't, the moment you keep building, that's when they panic because your success becomes evidence that their approval was never required. And in the next stretch of the story, that panic turns into something uglier than the original rejection, because my mother didn't just want me gone. She wanted control over the story of why I was gone. And the second my name showed up in a place she couldn't control, she moved fast, like a thief returning to the scene to steal the narrative too. So let me ask you this before I tell you what happened when she found out about my promotion and started making calls like she'd never disowned me at all. If your own mother deleted you from the family, like you were nothing, would you ever let her back in when the cameras showed up? Yes or no? Put it in the comments and be honest, because the next part is where the real manipulation starts, and I promise you, the way she tried to reclaim me was worse than the way she discarded me. The strange thing about being erased is that you don't immediately realize how much space you used to take up until you start noticing how quietly people rearrange themselves around your absence, and that's exactly what happened in the months after I disappeared. My family didn't rage, didn't chase, didn't demand explanations. They adjusted. They edited. They moved on like a company after layoffs, and I was supposed to feel ashamed for being the one who didn't survive the cut. I kept teaching. I kept showing up to Maple Creek Elementary every morning at 7:15 with coffee that tasted like burnt regret and optimism mixed together. I kept standing in front of fourth graders who didn't care what my mother thought of me, kids who cared about whether fractions made sense and whether I'd read one more chapter before lunch. And here's the part that messed with my head the most. The more invisible I became to my family, the more visible I became everywhere else. Not in a flashy way, not overnight, but in that slow, undeniable way where people start relying on you, trusting you, asking for your opinion because they've seen what happens when you're allowed to work without being humiliated into silence. 6 months after that Mother's Day, the principal pulled me aside and asked if I'd consider leading a new literacy intervention program. Test scores were lagging. Kids were slipping through cracks. She said my name like it meant something solid, like I wasn't a liability. I said yes before my fear could catch up with me. I spent nights building lesson frameworks, weekends analyzing reading data, mornings meeting with teachers who were burned out and desperate for something that worked. And it worked. Slowly at first, then noticeably. Reading levels rose. Kids who'd been labeled behind started catching up. Teachers stopped looking defeated in the hallways. Parents started emailing thank yous instead of complaints. And the more progress we made, the more something else happened that I didn't expect.
People started telling stories about me.
Not my family.
Me.
They talked about my classroom, my methods, my patience, my refusal to give up on kids everyone else had already written off. I didn't tell my mother any of this. I didn't tell Victoria or Bradley either. I told Marcus, and he listened the way people do when they're cataloging pride instead of collecting gossip. Lily would sit at the kitchen table coloring while I talked about my day, and she'd nod like she understood the weight of it even though she was only 6. That became my rhythm. Work that mattered. A home that felt warm. Silence from people who had decided I was disposable. And for a while, that silence was a relief. But silence has a shelf life, especially when the people who erased you start realizing the world didn't stop spinning without them. It started with Rachel again because Rachel was always the canary in the coal mine. She called me one night and said, "I need to tell you something, but promise you won't do anything rash." That's never a good opener. She told me my mother had been telling people at the country club that I was up for some big education thing, and that she'd always known I'd do something important. The words made my stomach twist. Always known,
I said.
She said that? Rachel sighed. She's rewriting history. She says she gave you your love of learning. That she supported you even when you chose a different path. A different path. Like teaching was a phase I went through to rebel before becoming respectable. I laughed, but it came out sharp. She disowned me, Rachel. I know, she said quietly. But she's acting like that never happened. That was my first real glimpse into what was coming. My mother wasn't done with me. She was just waiting until my life was shiny enough to reattach her name to it. And if you've ever dealt with someone like that, you know how dangerous that realization is, because it means they don't regret hurting you. They regret that it might make them look bad now. I tried to ignore it. I focused on my work. I finished my master's degree, one exhausting paper at a time, typing while Lily slept on the couch beside me, her head heavy on my leg, Marcus bringing me tea without being asked. I applied for assistant principal when the position opened up, convinced I wouldn't get it because I didn't have the right background, whatever that means when you strip it down. I got it anyway. The interview panel asked about leadership, about vision, about conflict resolution. No one asked what my parents did for a living. No one cared that my car was 12 years old. They cared that I knew how to build systems that didn't leave kids behind. The day they offered me the job, I sat in my car afterward and cried, not because I was surprised, but because it was the first time in my life that my success wasn't accompanied by a voice telling me it wasn't enough. Marcus hugged me so tight I felt my ribs creak, and Lily jumped up and down yelling, "My mom's the boss now." And that night, something settled in my chest that I hadn't even realized was missing. A sense of legitimacy that didn't require permission. And here's where things started to turn ugly, because success doesn't just attract admiration. It attracts opportunists. The first email from my mother came 2 weeks after the assistant principal announcement was published in the local paper. The subject line was, "Proud of you." I stared at it for a long time without opening it. My finger hovered over delete. Hovered over reply. I opened it eventually because curiosity is a trap we all fall into at least once. "My dearest Ingrid," it began, like we'd spoken yesterday instead of 4 years ago. "I saw the wonderful news about your promotion. I always knew you had leadership potential. Your father and I are so proud." No apology. No acknowledgement. No mention of the WhatsApp message that cut me out like a tumor. Just pride, retroactively applied, like she'd been there all along. She ended it with, "We should have lunch soon. Mother's Day is coming up." I closed the email and didn't respond. That should have been the end of it. But people like my mother don't see silence as a boundary. They see it as a negotiation tactic. The calls started next. Unknown numbers. Voicemails that said things like, "It's your mother. I don't know why you're being so distant." Distant. As if I'd gone on vacation without telling her. Victoria called too, suddenly warm, suddenly interested. "Mom's been worried about you," she said, her voice smooth like it always got when she wanted something. "She's not getting any younger, you know." That line hit like a cheap shot because it's designed to make you feel like time is a weapon you're misusing. I asked Rachel if my mother was actually sick. Rachel laughed, then stopped laughing and said, "She was at the spa yesterday." That's when it clicked fully. This wasn't reconciliation. This was damage control. And if you're listening right now, pause with me for a second and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there, because I want you to stay grounded in this moment. These tactics work because they're familiar, because they sound reasonable, Because society trains us to believe that cutting off family is always wrong, no matter what they do. I didn't respond to my mother. I didn't respond to Victoria either. And that refusal made them bolder. According to Rachel, my mother started telling extended family that I was going through something and that she was giving me space.
Space.
The word people use when they want to look generous while actively erasing your reality. And then, without warning, my name started appearing in places my mother couldn't control. The literacy program I'd built was adopted by 2 other schools. The district invited me to present at a regional education conference. My photo was printed on a flyer next to a quote about equity and access. I didn't think anyone in my family would see it. I was wrong. Rachel called me breathless. Victoria just shared your conference flyer in the family group chat. I felt that old drop in my stomach. What did she say? She wrote, "Isn't this our Ingrid?" with a smiley face. I closed my eyes. And my mom? She hasn't replied yet, but I heard her on the phone earlier. She was furious. Furious. Not proud. Not relieved. Furious that I was visible without her permission. Furious that the Africa lie was unraveling. Furious that people might start asking questions she couldn't answer without admitting she disowned her daughter for choosing teaching. And here's the thing about people like my mother. When they feel exposed, they don't reflect. They strategize. They don't apologize. They reposition. The repositioning came fast. Invitations I never asked for. Family dinners suddenly back on the table. Offers to help with Lily. Compliments that felt rehearsed. My mother even sent a gift, a leather planner embossed with my initials, like a corporate welcome package. I returned it unopened. And in the middle of all this, something else was happening that my mother couldn't touch. My relationship with Marcus deepened into something unshakable. He proposed under the oak tree on his property, the same one where we'd first talked about family and loss. Lily cried and hugged my leg like she was afraid I'd disappear too. We didn't invite my family. We didn't announce it on social media. We just built quietly, intentionally, without an audience. When we got married, it was small. Friends who had shown up. People who had watched me become myself without demanding a performance. Lily scattered flower petals and beamed like she'd solved a great mystery. I officially adopted her later that year, and the day the paperwork came through, she handed me a crayon drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. She wrote, "My mom, my dad, me," in wobbly letters. I pinned it above my desk at school. That drawing mattered more than any family photo my mother had ever staged. And that's when the real escalation began, because my mother didn't just want back into my life. She wanted access to the optics. She wanted to be seen as the proud matriarch of a rising education leader. She wanted to stand next to me in pictures and let people assume she'd been supportive all along. Rachel sent me screenshots that made my skin crawl. My mother planning outfits for events she hadn't been invited to. Telling Victoria and Bradley to be ready for upcoming recognition. Referring to my achievements as our family's moment. After 4 years of silence. After telling people not to mention my name. I realized then that my mother's love had never been about me. It had been about what I could reflect back to her. And when I stopped reflecting what she wanted, she discarded me. When I started reflecting admiration from others, she wanted me back. Not as a daughter, as an asset. That realization was sobering, but it was also clarifying. Because once you see that pattern, you can't unsee it. I started preparing myself mentally because I knew something bigger was coming. You don't claw back control this hard unless you sense a moment slipping out of reach. And sure enough, the call came on a Thursday afternoon that shifted everything. The Virginia Department of Education. A formal voice. An offer I never expected to be taken seriously. A position that would put my name on a stage my mother could never control. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, not with fear, but with anticipation. Because I knew, deep down, that this was the moment my mother had been circling. And I also knew something else, something I hadn't known 4 years earlier, when I saved those screenshots. I wasn't the scared daughter on the edge of a bed anymore, rereading words that erased me. I was someone with leverage. And leverage changes the game. In the next stretch of the story, that leverage forces a confrontation my mother never thought I'd survive long enough to initiate, and the way she tried to insert herself into my biggest moment revealed more about her than any argument ever could. So before I tell you exactly what she planned to do and how I decided to handle it, ask yourself this one question and answer it honestly in the comments. If someone only wants you back when your success makes them look good, do they actually want you? Or do they want your spotlight? because the next move I made wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more unsettling for people like her. It was about refusing to let her rewrite the story ever again. The call from the Department of Education didn't feel real at first, the kind of thing you replay in your head 3 times just to make sure you didn't hallucinate it from exhaustion. Because when you've spent your whole life being treated like the least impressive option in the room, recognition doesn't arrive as joy. It arrives as suspicion. And I remember sitting in my office staring at the wall after I hung up, listening to the hum of the old air conditioner, thinking this is the moment my mother has been waiting for, even if she doesn't know it yet. The offer wasn't just a promotion, it was visibility, the kind that comes with press releases and public ceremonies and people asking questions about where you came from, and I knew with a clarity that made my chest tight that my family would not stay quiet once my name started circulating in spaces they cared about. That night, I told Marcus first, then Lily, who clapped like I'd just told her we were going to Disney World, and as we sat at the kitchen table eating reheated pasta, I felt that strange dual emotion that comes when something good happens, but you know it's going to drag something ugly behind it like a shadow you can't outrun. The official announcement went live 2 weeks later, a clean professional headline, my photo taken at the school, my name spelled correctly for once, and within hours Rachel's name lit up my phone, which was how I knew the silence had ended. She didn't even say hello, just blurted out, "They've seen it," and my stomach dropped the same way it had the night she warned me about the WhatsApp message years ago. She told me my sister had shared the article in the family group chat with a caption that tried to sound casual but reeked of ownership, and that my mother had immediately started calling people, not to congratulate me, but to ask who else had seen it, how big it was, whether it would be televised. Televised. That word told me everything. The concern wasn't pride, it was optics. The concern wasn't me, it was how many people were about to realize I hadn't disappeared into some vague overseas charity the way she'd been telling everyone. I didn't respond to anyone. I went home, helped Lily with her spelling words, listened to Marcus talk about crop rotation like it was the most important thing in the world, and tried to keep my nervous system from spiraling, because part of healing is learning not to let people who already hurt you steal the peace you fought to build. 2 days later, the first email arrived, this one from my mother's personal account, not the shared family one, which felt intentional, like she was testing whether a private channel would get a different reaction. It was longer than the last, full of exclamation points and phrases like family support and so proud we could burst, and buried halfway through was the real reason she was reaching out, a line that said, "The award ceremony will be such a special moment for all of us," as if my life had been a group project she supervised. I didn't reply, and that silence clearly panicked her, because the escalation came fast. Victoria called. Bradley texted. My aunt emailed. It was like watching a coordinated campaign roll out, each message slightly different but carrying the same underlying demand. Let us back in now that you're worth something again. Rachel kept feeding me updates, screenshots of messages I wasn't supposed to see, my mother planning outfits, my sister suggesting photographers, my brother talking about leveraging the moment, and every time I read one my resolve hardened, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation, because nothing about those messages sounded like remorse, they sounded like a brand relaunch. I had long conversations with Marcus late at night after Lily was asleep, sitting on the porch listening to cicadas, and I admitted the part of this that scared me the most wasn't confrontation, it was doubt. The fear that in the middle of all this I'd start questioning myself again, wondering if maybe I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too dramatic, because that's the trap people like my mother set. They injure you, and then frame your boundaries as cruelty. Marcus didn't rush to reassure me. He just listened, and then he said something that stuck. He said, "People who really regret hurting you don't try to control the setting where forgiveness happens." And that sentence replayed in my head every time another message came in asking to talk privately or clear the air right before a public event. As the ceremony date got closer, the pressure intensified, and it wasn't just emotional, it was logistical, because my mother started contacting organizers directly, introducing herself as my biggest supporter, asking about seating, asking if there was a family segment, and when I found out, something in me went very still. This wasn't just about reclaiming me. This was about hijacking the narrative in real time, inserting herself into my moment so convincingly that anyone watching would assume she'd been there all along. I scheduled a call with one of the coordinators, explained calmly that my family situation was complicated and that I would be handling acknowledgments myself, and to their credit they didn't push back, but hanging up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the realization that this was no longer something I could avoid by staying quiet. This was coming to a head whether I liked it or not. Midway through all this, pause with me for a second and tell me where you're watching from right now, because moments like this hit differently depending on where you are in your own story, and I want you grounded here. Not just listening, but present, because what comes next isn't about grand gestures. It's about small decisions that change the power dynamic forever. The week before the ceremony, Rachel sent me a screenshot that made my chest go cold. A message from my mother to the family group chat saying she had confirmed attendance and that everyone should be prepared to stand together, as if my consent was optional. That was the moment I stopped feeling anxious and started feeling clear. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was done being maneuvered. I called Rachel and told her to stop sending me updates, not because I didn't care, but because I'd seen enough to make a decision. I sat down with Marcus that night and told him exactly what I planned to do, and when I finished, he didn't look surprised. He just nodded slowly and said, "That's going to hurt them." And I said, "I know, but it's not punishment, it's honesty." The night before the ceremony, I wrote my speech alone at the kitchen table. Not a dramatic monologue, not a call-out, just a clean acknowledgement of the people who had actually shown up in my life. And I practiced reading it without shaking, because the hardest thing in the world isn't telling your story, it's telling it plainly without cushioning it for the comfort of the people who hurt you. The morning of the ceremony, I woke up early, made Lily pancakes, helped her into the dress she was excited to wear, and drove to the venue feeling oddly calm, like the storm had already passed, and I was just walking through the aftermath. When we arrived, I could feel it before I saw it, the tension in the air, the way conversations dipped when people recognized my name, and as we took our seats, I noticed movement behind us. Familiar perfume, familiar posture, my family sliding into the row like they belonged there, and for a brief moment, I felt that old reflex to turn around, to smile, to make it easier, but I didn't, because I'd learned something important in the years since they erased me. Silence can be a boundary just as powerful as words. The program started. Speeches rolled on, my name was announced, and as I stood and walked toward the stage, I felt the weight of every choice I'd made since that Mother's Day, every moment I'd chosen not to beg, not to explain, not to perform my pain for people who wouldn't hold it gently. Standing at the podium, looking out at the audience, I didn't feel small, I felt anchored, and when I thanked my colleagues, my mentors, my husband, my daughter, I did it with my whole chest because they were the truth, and I stopped there, no add-ons, no last-minute nods to people who hadn't earned it. I heard the shift behind me immediately, the intake of breath, the rustle of fabric, the whisper of my name spoken with disbelief, and I kept going because the most powerful thing you can do to someone who expects access is deny it without drama. When I finished, the applause wasn't polite, it was real, and as I walked back to my seat, Lily squeezed my hand and whispered, "You did it, Mom." And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The confrontation came later, in the hallway, my mother's face tight with humiliation, her voice low and furious, accusing me of embarrassing her, and I listened without interrupting, because listening doesn't mean agreeing, and when she finally stopped, waiting for me to soften, I said calmly, "You told everyone I wasn't your daughter," and watched the words land, watched her scramble for context, for excuses, for a version of reality that made her look less cruel, and I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I just repeated, "I believed you," and walked away. What followed in the weeks after was quieter, but no less telling, the subtle fallout, the whispers, the distancing, the way people who had once admired my mother's polish started seeing the cracks, and through it all, I stayed focused on my work, my home, my chosen family, because the real victory wasn't that moment on stage, it was the fact that I didn't need it to feel whole. And here's what I want you to sit with before we go further, because this story isn't done yet. If someone only shows up when your success becomes useful to them, are they proud of you? Or are they afraid of what your independence says about them? And if you've ever faced that question yourself, stay with me, because what happened after the cameras were gone forced a reckoning none of us could have predicted, and the way it unfolded changed how I understand forgiveness, power, and what it really means to move on. The days after the ceremony didn't explode the way people imagine justice does. There was no viral meltdown, no screaming match caught on camera, just a slow, surgical unraveling that felt more unsettling than fireworks ever could, because when you expose a truth people have worked years to hide, the damage shows up quietly in the spaces they thought were safe. The first sign came from Rachel, who texted me 3 mornings later with a single sentence that made me pause mid-sip of coffee. "People are asking questions," and when I asked what kind, she sent screenshots from her own inbox. Women from the country club, distant relatives, even a former colleague of my mother's, all asking some version of the same thing. Why did Margaret say her daughter wasn't family? Why did the teacher comment come out of her mouth like it was poison? Why did she look so shocked when you said it back to her? That's when I understood something important. My mother had spent decades controlling a narrative where she was admired but not examined, and the moment scrutiny arrived, She didn't have the tools to handle it because admiration is passive, but examination is not. I didn't respond to any of it directly. I went to work, sat in meetings, signed paperwork, dealt with the unglamorous reality of leadership because there is something deeply grounding about responsibility when chaos tries to pull you back into old emotional patterns. Marcus noticed the shift in me before I did. The way I slept better, the way I laughed more easily, the way my shoulders weren't permanently tense, and one night while we were cleaning up after dinner he said, "You look lighter." And I realized he was right, not because anything had been resolved, but because I'd stopped waiting for people who hurt me to validate the pain they caused. The second sign came in the form of silence from my siblings. Victoria didn't call to argue. Bradley didn't send a carefully worded message trying to smooth things over, and that absence was louder than any confrontation because it told me they were assessing damage, not reflecting on behavior. A week later, my mother tried a different tactic. She sent a handwritten card, the kind she always used for condolences and thank you notes, the kind designed to feel intimate. And inside she wrote about how families go through phases and how public misunderstandings can be corrected with grace. Never once using the word sorry, never once naming the specific harm, and I read it the same way you read a contract, looking for what's missing because apologies that don't name the injury are just invitations to forget it happened.
I didn't reply.
Around this time, the local paper published a follow-up piece about educational leadership in the county, and my name was mentioned again, casually, professionally, without drama. And that's when the tone of the outreach changed, because now it wasn't just gossip, it was permanence. My success wasn't a one-off headline anymore, it was a pattern, and people who had treated me like an inconvenience were realizing I wasn't going anywhere. Midway through this, pause with me again, and tell me where you're watching from right now, not because I need the numbers, but because stories like this tend to pull buried memories to the surface, and I want you anchored in the present while we go deeper, because the next shift didn't come from my family, it came from me. One afternoon, I was cleaning out an old box in the closet, papers from my first year's teaching, lesson plans, handwritten notes from parents, and I found a folded piece of paper I'd forgotten existed, a letter I wrote to myself during my second year in the classroom, back when I was exhausted and doubting everything, and in it I'd written, "If they never see your value, it doesn't mean it isn't there." And reading my own words from a younger version of myself felt like time collapsing in on itself, because the core wound hadn't changed, only the scale had. That's when I realized the reckoning I'd triggered wasn't just external, it was internal. I was no longer measuring my worth against the approval of people who equated love with optics, and that shift scared my mother more than the public embarrassment ever could, because control lost quietly is harder to reclaim than control challenged loudly. Rachel called again, this time with a tone I hadn't heard before, not alarmed, not guilty, just tired, and she told me my mother had started reframing the story to anyone who would listen, saying she'd been misunderstood, that she'd been joking, that people were too sensitive, and hearing that didn't hurt the way it once would have. It just confirmed something I already knew. People who can't tolerate accountability will always call clarity cruelty. About 2 weeks later, an invitation arrived addressed to both Marcus and me, a charity gala at the country club, my mother listed as a co-chair, and I laughed out loud when I read it, not because it was funny, but because it was transparent. This was her attempt to re-establish proximity, to appear united, to pull me back into a space where she could reclaim the visual narrative. Marcus asked if I wanted to go just to see what would happen, and for a brief moment I considered it, not out of longing but out of curiosity, and then I shook my head because curiosity is not a good enough reason to re-enter environments that taught you to shrink. I declined politely, no explanation, and that's when the third sign appeared, anger. My mother called, left a voicemail, her voice tight, accusing me of being ungrateful, of airing private matters in public, of ruining her reputation, and that voicemail was the closest thing to honesty I'd heard from her in years, because it finally named what she cared about most, not the relationship, not the loss, the reputation. I saved it, not out of spite, but out of clarity, because sometimes hearing the truth spoken plainly is what seals the door for good. In the following days, I noticed how often people tried to pull me into moral debates about forgiveness, colleagues saying things like, "But she's still your mother," or "Family is complicated," and I started answering with something simple and disarming. So is accountability, because the idea that biology entitles someone to infinite grace is one of the most effective tools abusers have ever been handed. What surprised me most was how many people pulled me aside after meetings or events to share their own stories, parents who favored one sibling, families who only showed up when success was visible, and I realized this wasn't just my story, it was a pattern, one that thrives in silence and dies in daylight. One evening, Lily asked me why Grandma hadn't come over in a long time, and I knelt down to her level and said, "Sometimes adults make choices that aren't safe for our hearts," and she nodded like that made perfect sense, because children understand boundaries more naturally than adults who've spent years ignoring them. The fourth sign came quietly. My mother stopped calling, not because she'd accepted anything, but because the tactics weren't working, and when manipulation fails, withdrawal is often the last move, and that silence, unlike the earlier one, didn't feel like abandonment, it felt like relief. A month later, Rachel told me my mother had stepped down from another social committee, citing stress, and I thought about how exhausting it must be to maintain a facade when the audience has changed, because once people see behind the curtain, the performance becomes unbearable. Through all of this, I kept doing the work, meeting with principals, advocating for teachers, building programs, because the most effective rebuttal to being called lowly is sustained impact, not revenge. There was one moment, though, that almost pulled me back, an email from my mother that arrived late at night, shorter than the others, saying she didn't recognize me anymore, that I'd become cold, and for a split second I felt that old ache, the desire to explain myself, to soften the edges, to reassure her that I was still the daughter she raised. And then I stopped, because that sentence revealed everything. She didn't recognize me because I no longer centered my identity around her approval.
I didn't reply.
Instead, I wrote in my journal, something I'd started doing again, and I wrote, "If becoming myself makes me unrecognizable to you, that's not a loss I need to grieve." The tension didn't disappear overnight, but it transformed. It moved from my chest into the background, like noise you stop noticing once you realize it can't hurt you. And just when I thought the story was settling into a quieter chapter, something unexpected happened, something that forced me to confront a different question entirely, not about confrontation or boundaries, but about legacy, because a letter arrived that didn't ask for reconciliation, didn't argue, didn't accuse, and reading it made me realize the hardest part of betrayal isn't the moment it happens. It's deciding what you do when the person who hurt you finally stops pretending it didn't. And that decision, the one I made after reading that letter, would test everything I thought I'd learned about strength, compassion, and what it really means to move forward. So stay with me, because the next turn in this story isn't about exposure or applause. It's about a choice that doesn't come with a script and a consequence no one sees coming. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon tucked between routine mail and a school district memo, and at first I didn't recognize the handwriting because I'd trained myself not to, but the weight of it in my hand was unmistakable, heavier than paper should be, heavier because it carried years of things unsaid, and because I knew before opening it that whatever was inside would try to pull me back into a role I no longer played. The accommodating daughter, the one who explained herself, the one who absorbed disappointment quietly so other people could stay comfortable, and I stood there in the kitchen staring at the envelope while the kettle screamed on the stove, letting it boil too long, because sometimes hesitation is the last line of defense before a boundary gets tested again. When I finally opened it, the words weren't dramatic or explosive. There were no accusations, no commands, no obvious manipulation, which somehow made it more dangerous, because subtlety has always been my mother's sharpest tool, and she wrote about reflection and loneliness, and how she'd been forced to confront things she didn't like about herself since the ceremony, how people she thought were friends had distanced themselves, how she'd been misunderstood, and how pain had a way of hardening hearts on all sides. And as I read, I noticed what she still didn't say. She didn't name what she did. She didn't quote her own words. She didn't say lowly teacher. She didn't say I no longer see her as my daughter. She didn't say, I chose reputation over you, and that absence mattered more than anything else on the page. The letter ended with an invitation, not a request, an invitation to meet privately, just the two of us, to talk without an audience. And my hand shook a little when I set it down, not because I missed her, but because the old conditioning kicked in, the reflex that says good daughters give people a chance. Good daughters don't hold grudges, good daughters smooth things over, and I had to remind myself that boundaries aren't grudges. They're consequences, and consequences don't disappear just because the discomfort gets inconvenient. Marcus found me sitting there later, the letter folded neatly beside my coffee mug, and he didn't ask questions. He just said, "Do you want to talk about it?" Which was a gift in itself, because it left the choice with me, and I realized how different love feels when it doesn't demand a performance. I told him what the letter said and what it didn't say, and he listened without interrupting, and then he asked a question that cut through everything else. "If you meet her, what are you hoping will happen?" And I didn't have an answer right away, because hope is tricky. It disguises itself as optimism when it's really longing, and longing is where people who hurt you still have leverage. Over the next few days, I noticed how the idea of meeting her occupied space in my head, not constantly, but persistently, like background static, and I started paying attention to my body instead of my thoughts. The tightness in my chest when I imagined sitting across from her, the shallow breath, the familiar urge to explain my choices like a thesis defense. And those signals told me more than any rational argument ever could. At work, Things kept moving forward, meetings, initiatives, the steady rhythm of leadership, and that contrast made everything clearer because in every other area of my life I felt grounded and capable, and the only place I felt small again was in the hypothetical space where I allowed my mother back into my emotional orbit. About halfway through that week, pause here with me and tell me where you're watching from right now, because this is the part of the story where a lot of people start projecting their own experiences onto mine, and I want you present for what comes next because the decision I made wasn't dramatic, but it was definitive. I wrote her back, not with anger, not with softness, but with precision, and I thanked her for reaching out and acknowledged that reflection can be uncomfortable, and then I set a condition. I said that if we were going to meet, it would be with a mediator present, someone neutral, because history had shown that private conversations between us tended to become revisionist exercises where her feelings replaced facts, and I needed accountability, not reinterpretation. I didn't accuse, I didn't justify, I simply stated the boundary and waited. The response came faster than I expected, a short email this time, saying that mediation felt unnecessary, that family matters should be handled privately, that involving a third party would make things adversarial, and there it was, the confirmation I needed, because people who are ready to take responsibility don't fear witnesses, and I replied one last time, saying that my condition stood, and that if she wasn't comfortable with it, I understood and wished her well. After that, the communication stopped. There was no blow-up, no dramatic exit, just a quiet cessation, and surprisingly, that quiet didn't feel like loss, it felt like resolution because for the first time the ending wasn't dictated by her, it was shaped by my self-respect. In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle changes in myself, the way I spoke about my past with less defensiveness, the way I corrected people when they made assumptions about reconciliation, the way I stopped framing boundaries as temporary measures and started treating them as permanent structures. Rachel told me that my mother had told relatives I was being stubborn and influenced by my husband, a narrative I'd anticipated, because accountability often gets outsourced to convenient villains, and instead of reacting, I laughed, because it was almost comforting how predictable it all was, like watching an old rerun where you already know every line. What mattered more was what was happening closer to home. Lily started asking questions about family, not about absence, but about difference, why some people had grandparents who visited and some didn't, and those conversations were honest without being heavy, and I realized that by choosing clarity over appeasement, I was teaching her something I never learned as a child, that love doesn't require self-erasure. One afternoon at school, a teacher pulled me aside after a staff meeting and said she'd watched the ceremony online and that it had given her the courage to finally stop taking calls from a parent who only reached out to criticize her career choices, and that moment hit me harder than any applause ever could, because it reminded me that stories like mine ripple outward in ways you can't predict, and that sometimes speaking the truth doesn't just free you, it gives other people permission to do the same. As summer approached, invitations slowed, the social noise faded, and the narrative around my mother quietly shifted from admiration to ambiguity, not because I campaigned against her, but because truth has a way of destabilizing carefully curated images once it's introduced, and I watched from a distance, without satisfaction or gloating, because by then I understood that the opposite of needing approval isn't seeking revenge, it's indifference. There was one moment, though, that brought everything full circle, a school board event where parents and educators gathered informally, and an older woman approached me, someone I recognized vaguely from my childhood, a friend of my mother's from years ago, and she said, "I always wondered why you disappeared," and I told her simply that I hadn't disappeared, I just stopped explaining myself, and she nodded slowly, like that answered more questions than she'd expected. Later that night, sitting on the porch with Marcus while the sun dipped low and the air cooled, I thought about how betrayal often gets framed as a single event, a moment, a message, a sentence that cuts deep. But the truth is it's usually a pattern, reinforced over time, and healing isn't about confronting that pattern once, it's about refusing to participate in it again. The letter from my mother stayed in a drawer, not as a reminder of pain but as evidence of growth, proof that I could receive something without letting it redefine me. And when I think back to the girl I was at that folding table years ago, trying to make herself smaller so she wouldn't inconvenience anyone, I wish I could tell her what I know now, that being excluded from places that require you to betray yourself is not a failure, it's an invitation to build something better. And just when I settled into that understanding, just when life felt steady and unremarkable in the best possible way, another opportunity surfaced, one that would force my family's name back into public conversation again, not through confrontation, but through legacy, and the way that opportunity intersected with everything I'd learned about power, visibility, and choice made it impossible to ignore, because sometimes the final test of growth isn't whether you can walk away, it's whether you can step forward without carrying old chains with you, And what happened next put that lesson to the ultimate test, in a way I never saw coming and couldn't have planned for. So stay with me, because the next turn isn't about my mother trying to reclaim me. It's about me deciding what parts of my story I'm willing to let define the future. The call came on a Monday morning while I was standing in the hallway outside my office watching two fourth graders argue about whose turn it was to water the classroom plants, the kind of small, ordinary moment that usually grounds me. And when my phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, I almost ignored it because leadership trains you to triage interruptions, but something made me step aside and answer. And the voice on the other end introduced herself as a representative from a statewide education foundation that partnered with the governor's office, and she spoke carefully, like someone delivering information that could change the temperature of a room, and she said they were launching a new initiative focused on rural education reform, a multi-year program with funding, visibility, and policy influence, and that my name had come up repeatedly in recommendation meetings, not just as a participant, but as a potential public face of the initiative, someone who could articulate why education mattered beyond test scores and prestige. And as she spoke, I felt that familiar mix of excitement and caution, because opportunities like that don't arrive without strings. And I asked what the role would entail, and she said it would involve speaking engagements, advisory panels, and a high-profile kickoff event at the state capitol. And there it was again, the place where my story had collided with my family's image. And even though she didn't mention them, I felt the echo immediately. After we hung up, I stood there longer than necessary, watching the kids resolve their argument without adult intervention, and it struck me how much growth happens quietly when people are trusted to work things out, and how often adults sabotage that by imposing their own unresolved conflicts. And I realized this opportunity wasn't just about career advancement. It was about visibility, about choosing whether to step further into the public eye, knowing exactly who might try to step in beside me again. At lunch that day, I told Marcus about the call, and he didn't respond right away, which I've learned means he's thinking deeply, not hesitating, and he asked what my first instinct was, not what I thought I should do. And my first instinct surprised me, because it wasn't fear or anger or even excitement, it was clarity, a sense that I wanted to do it not to prove anything, but because it aligned with who I'd become, and that distinction mattered. Still, clarity doesn't cancel consequence. And over the next few days, I played out scenarios in my head, press coverage, introductions, bios that would inevitably mention family background, and I wondered whether my mother would see this as another opening, another stage she could try to reclaim, and I reminded myself that boundaries don't depend on other people's behavior. They depend on your own consistency. When the formal invitation arrived, I accepted with conditions, not dramatic ones, just professional parameters about representation and communication, and I noticed how different that felt from the way I used to approach things. No over-explaining, no preemptive apologies, just stating what I needed and trusting that if it wasn't respected, that would be information too. The planning meetings began, and I found myself in rooms with people who spoke in acronyms and impact metrics, and I learned to translate my lived experience into language that policymakers could hear without diluting its truth. And that process was strangely healing, because it allowed me to own my narrative without centering the pain, to talk about resilience without romanticizing suffering. Halfway through this whirlwind, pause with me again, and tell me where you're watching from, because this is the point where the internal work meets the external test. And if you've ever felt like growth invites scrutiny instead of peace, you'll understand what happened next. The foundation announced the initiative publicly, and my name was included in the press release as a lead advisor. And within hours, my email filled with congratulations, requests for interviews, and one message that made my stomach drop. It was from a journalist asking if I'd be willing to comment on how my family influenced my passion for education, and I stared at that line for a long time, because it was neutral on the surface but loaded underneath, and I realized this was the moment where I got to decide whether my story would be framed by absence or by intention. I responded with a brief statement focusing on mentors, colleagues, and community, and declined to discuss family beyond that. And to my surprise, the journalist respected it, because not everyone is looking for drama. Some are looking for substance, and that was another lesson I wish I'd learned earlier. Of course, not everyone was respectful, and Rachel called me that evening to warn me that my mother had been telling people she was proud of my involvement, that she'd always supported my passion for education, that the past had been misunderstood, and instead of reacting, I felt something close to compassion, not the kind that invites reconciliation, but the kind that recognizes desperation when you see it. And I told Rachel I didn't need updates anymore, not because I didn't care about her, but because staying informed was starting to feel like staying entangled. The kickoff event was scheduled for early fall, and as the date approached, I focused on preparation, crafting remarks that spoke to equity and access without slipping into platitudes. And one evening while practicing in the living room, Lily asked why I talked about school like it was a person I loved, and I laughed and told her that sometimes love looks like showing up even when it's hard, and she nodded like that made perfect sense. Because kids understand commitment in ways adults complicate. The night before the event, I didn't sleep much, not from nerves, but from anticipation, and I thought about how far I'd come from that group chat message years ago, how something meant to erase me had instead sharpened my sense of self, and I felt grateful, not for the pain, but for the clarity it forced. The event itself was polished and formal, banners, speeches, cameras, and as I took the stage, I felt grounded, not because I was immune to judgment, but because I knew who I was speaking for, the teachers in underfunded classrooms, the students whose potential is too often measured by zip codes. And I spoke with conviction, not defiance, and the response was immediate, applause that felt earned, conversations afterward that felt substantive, and for a moment, I allowed myself to simply be present in the success without scanning the room for threats. It was only later, during the reception, that I sensed the shift, the subtle tightening of space, the way people adjust when something unexpected enters their field, and when I turned, I saw her, my mother, standing near the edge of the room, not making a scene, just existing, and the old reflex flared for a split second, the urge to brace, to prepare, to manage, and then it faded, replaced by something steadier, because I realized she no longer had the power to define the moment, only to witness it. She didn't approach me, not then, and I didn't approach her, and that mutual distance spoke volumes, because it meant the narrative wasn't hers to control anymore, and when Marcus found me later, and asked if I was okay, I realized I genuinely was not numb, not dissociated, just calm. In the days that followed, coverage of the initiative grew, discussions sparked, and I received messages from educators across the state who felt seen by the language I used, and that feedback mattered more than any family reconciliation ever could, because it affirmed that my voice had value beyond personal validation. Still, unresolved things have a way of resurfacing when you least expect them, and a week later, I received another letter from my mother, shorter this time, acknowledging that she'd attended the event, expressing pride, and asking if we could talk, and I noticed how the request felt different now, less urgent, less loaded, and I realized that growth doesn't always come from closure. Sometimes it comes from repetition, from choosing the same boundary again, and again, until it becomes second nature. I didn't respond right away, not because I was conflicted, but because I didn't feel rushed, and that might have been the biggest change of all, the absence of urgency, the understanding that my life didn't hinge on her response or approval. Instead, I focused on what was unfolding, planning sessions, policy drafts, meetings that hinted at real change, and in those spaces, I was valued for my expertise, not my lineage, and that reinforced something essential, that the family you build through shared purpose can be just as formative as the one you're born into. One evening, sitting on the porch as the air cooled and the day settled, Marcus asked me what I thought would happen next, with my mother, with all of it, and I told him the truth, that I didn't know, and for once, that uncertainty didn't scare me, because I trusted myself to handle whatever came with integrity. What I didn't know then was that the next development wouldn't come from her directly, but from the consequences of her choices intersecting with mine in a way neither of us could avoid, a collision of past and present that would force a reckoning not just between us, but in how our shared history would be understood by others, and that moment, when it arrived, would test every boundary I'd built, not to see if they'd break, but to see if they'd hold under pressure. And that's where this story turns again, not toward confrontation for its own sake, but toward a decision that would define what accountability looks like when the audience is watching and the stakes are no longer personal but public. So stay with me, because what came next wasn't loud or explosive, but it was undeniable, and it changed the balance in ways I couldn't have scripted if I tried. The morning everything shifted again, I was driving Lily to school, the radio low, the sky still undecided between gray and blue, when my phone buzzed through the car's speakers with Rachel's name, and I almost ignored it because school mornings are sacred and interruptions tend to linger, but something in my chest tightened and I answered, and she didn't bother with pleasantries, she just said, "She's panicking." And I asked who, even though I already knew, and Rachel exhaled hard and said my mother had been called into a meeting at the country club, not for tea or committees or polite nonsense, but for a conversation about conduct, because apparently more than one member had forwarded clips from the ceremony, the moment where I spoke calmly and she froze, and questions were being asked that couldn't be brushed off with vague smiles or curated lies, and as Rachel talked, I felt a strange mix of emotions, not triumph, not pity, but a sober recognition that consequences don't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive as quiet calendar invites that change the way people look at you. I dropped Lily off, waved until she disappeared through the doors, and sat in the car longer than usual, letting the engine idle, because this was one of those moments where the past tries to tug at your sleeve and ask for attention, and I needed to decide how much I was willing to give. At work that day, meetings blurred together, but underneath it all there was a steady hum of awareness, the sense that something was unfolding beyond my immediate control, and instead of fighting that, I leaned into routine, because routine has always been my anchor. The way I remind myself that life doesn't stop just because old wounds are reopening somewhere else. Around noon, a colleague asked how I was handling the increased visibility, and I answered honestly that it felt less like pressure and more like responsibility, and saying it out loud made it true, because when you stop framing growth as a threat, it becomes a tool. Halfway through the afternoon, my phone buzzed again, this time with an email from the Foundation's communications team asking if I'd be willing to participate in a televised panel discussion about educational leadership and family influence. And there it was again, the framing that always seems innocent until you've lived through what it can cost, and I replied with a careful yes, on the condition that the conversation remain focused on professional mentorship and systemic support rather than personal biography, and to their credit, they agreed without pushback, which reinforced a lesson I keep learning, that boundaries spoken calmly often land more firmly than boundaries defended emotionally. That evening, Marcus noticed my quiet and asked what was circling in my head, and I told him about Rachel's call, about the club, about the questions my mother could no longer dodge, and he listened the way he always does, without interrupting, without rushing to fix, and when I finished he asked, "Do you feel responsible for what's happening to her?" And I thought about it carefully before answering because, reflexively, I used to feel responsible for everyone's discomfort, but now the answer came easier, and I said no. I felt responsible for telling the truth when asked and for not lying to protect someone else's image, and he nodded because that distinction matters, especially when people try to confuse accountability with cruelty. We talked about Lily, about how children watch not just what you say but what you tolerate, and how modeling self-respect is often quieter than modeling forgiveness, but just as important, and I realized that whatever happened next with my mother would be less about her reaction, and more about my consistency. The panel discussion was scheduled for the following week, and preparation gave me something constructive to focus on, crafting responses that highlighted teachers who'd shaped me, systems that had failed students, and the ways leadership can either replicate harm or interrupt it. And in rehearsing those points, I noticed how little my family story needed to be named to be present, because it had already informed my values in ways that didn't require explanation. Midweek, pause with me and tell me where you're watching from, because this is the stretch of the story where the tension isn't loud but it's heavy, where you sense a collision coming even if you can't see the shape of it yet, and if you've ever felt that quiet dread before a confrontation you didn't schedule, you're exactly where I was. The night before the panel, Rachel texted me a photo, not with commentary, just an image of the agenda from a country club meeting, my mother's name listed under a discussion item labeled reputational concerns, and I stared at it longer than I should have, because seeing your parent reduced to an agenda item does something to your nervous system. It reminds you that the structures people hide behind will always prioritize themselves when forced to choose. I didn't respond to Rachel right away because I didn't want to spiral, and instead I went upstairs to read with Lily, letting her stumble through words and correct herself proudly, and in that simple act I found grounding, because this is the work that matters, not status, not perception, but presence. The panel itself was uneventful in the best way, thoughtful questions, honest answers, and afterward a few educators approached me to say they felt validated hearing someone speak about leadership without pretending it's always neat, and that feedback filled a space that approval from my family never could. 2 days later, the call I'd been expecting finally came, not from my mother directly, but from an unfamiliar number that introduced itself as a representative from the country club's board, asking if I had a moment to discuss a matter involving my family, and I laughed softly before responding, because the irony of institutions seeking clarity from the person they once ignored was not lost on me, and I told them I could spare a few minutes. The conversation was formal, cautious, and oddly deferential, explaining that my mother had cited me in several defenses of her conduct, positioning herself as a proud supporter of my work, and the board wanted to verify whether that portrayal was accurate. And in that moment, I felt the full weight of choice, because I could have softened it, allowed ambiguity to protect her. But I thought about the students I advocate for, the importance of naming reality without embellishment, and I answered. Simply, that my mother and I were estranged for several years due to her expressed disapproval of my career, that our relationship was limited, and that any claims of consistent support would be inaccurate. And there's a pause on the line, the kind that signals information landing heavily, and then the representative thanked me for my honesty and ended the call. Afterward, I sat quietly, letting the adrenaline fade, because telling the truth in professional language can be more exhausting than confrontation, and I needed a moment to recalibrate. That evening, my mother emailed me again, this time with urgency bleeding through the words, asking why I hadn't defended her, why I'd allowed her to be embarrassed, accusing me of enjoying her downfall, and I noticed how quickly she reverted to accusation when control slipped, and instead of responding immediately, I waited until my body felt calm, because reactive honesty rarely serves anyone, and when I did reply, it was brief and clear, saying that I hadn't attacked her. I'd simply answered a direct question truthfully, that protecting her image at the cost of my reality was something I was no longer willing to do, and that any further communication would need to respect that boundary. She responded with anger, then with sorrow, then with something like bargaining, offering apologies that were vague and future-focused, and I read them without absorbing them because apologies that arrive only when consequences do are complicated things, and I wasn't prepared to untangle that yet. Days passed, and the noise around the club subsided, but the ripple effects continued quietly. Invitations declined, committees reshuffled, and Rachel confirmed that my mother's social standing had shifted in ways she couldn't smooth over, and while part of me felt sadness for her, a larger part felt resolved, because this wasn't revenge, it was gravity, the natural pull of truth asserting itself. At home, life continued in its messy, beautiful way. Lily lost another tooth, Marcus fixed a fence, and I found myself laughing more easily, sleeping more deeply, because unresolved tension had finally begun to loosen its grip. One afternoon, while walking the dog, I ran into a former neighbor of my parents who recognized me and commented on how inspiring my recent work was, and then added casually that my mother must be proud, and instead of freezing or deflecting, I smiled and said my pride came from the impact, not from family approval, and the ease with which the words came surprised me, because it meant I'd internalized them. The next development arrived not as conflict but as opportunity, an invitation to advise on a statewide mentorship program that would pair early career teachers with experienced leaders, and as I reviewed the proposal, I realized this was the kind of legacy I wanted, not one built on name recognition, but on access and support, and committing to that felt like choosing forward motion over fixation. Still, stories like this don't resolve neatly, and I knew there would be another turn, another attempt to rewrite or reclaim, because people who lose control rarely accept it quietly, and sure enough, a few weeks later, my mother requested a mediated conversation through a mutual acquaintance, framing it as a chance for healing, and I considered it seriously, weighing the potential benefits against the emotional cost, and I decided not yet, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I was finally at a place where my life wasn't organized around managing her reactions, and I wasn't ready to disrupt that stability. I communicated that decision respectfully, emphasizing that healing takes time and consistency, not urgency driven by social fallout, and whether she understood or not was no longer my responsibility. As autumn settled in, leaves changing outside my office window, I reflected on how strange it is that growth often looks like loss from the outside, and how letting go of old narratives creates space for new ones to take root, and I realized that the real reckoning wasn't public or dramatic, it was internal. The moment you stop waiting for validation from the people who withheld it, and start trusting the life you've built to speak for itself. There was still more to come. I could feel it, because the past rarely releases its grip all at once. But for the first time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was standing steady, knowing that whatever surfaced next would meet a version of me that no longer folded to keep others comfortable, and that confidence, quiet and unyielding, was the true turning point. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but changes everything, and as this chapter closed, another opened just out of view, carrying with it a test not of my resilience, but of my willingness to choose peace over performance when the spotlight shifted again. So stay with me, because the next moment would force that choice in a way I hadn't anticipated, and how I handled it would determine not just the narrative, but the future I was finally allowing myself to inhabit. The shift I didn't expect came quietly, not with another call or email or public moment, but with a small envelope slipped under my office door on a Tuesday afternoon when the building was nearly empty and the janitor's cart rattled down the hall like punctuation to a sentence I hadn't finished reading yet. And I stood there for a moment just looking at the envelope because it wasn't official letterhead, and it wasn't personal handwriting either, just my name typed cleanly, neutrally, the way people do when they don't want to reveal too much, and something in my chest tightened because by then I'd learned that the most consequential things rarely announce themselves loudly. I took it inside, closed the door, sat at my desk, and opened it slowly, and inside was an invitation printed on heavy cream stock to a private donor dinner connected to the mentorship program I'd recently agreed to advise, an exclusive event with a short guest list, state leaders, major donors, and a note in the corner handwritten by the program director thanking me for my leadership and asking if I'd be willing to say a few words about the importance of sustained support rather than one time recognition, and I smiled because this was exactly the kind of platform that mattered to me, the kind that changed systems instead of optics. I checked the date and felt that familiar internal pause because it landed on the same weekend as a major family holiday, the kind that used to dictate my calendar by default, and even though I no longer attended those gatherings, I was aware that overlap like that tends to stir things whether you want it to or not. I accepted the invitation, replied thoughtfully, and moved on with my day, or at least I tried to. But by evening, Rachel was calling again, her voice carrying that particular mix of hesitation and urgency that always meant something was brewing, and she told me my mother had heard about the dinner through the same channels she always monitored, that she'd been asking questions about whether she'd be invited, whether families were expected to attend, whether it would be televised, and as Rachel talked, I felt the familiar pattern trying to reassert itself, my mother positioning herself near moments of significance, like a moth drawn to a carefully curated flame. I thanked Rachel and told her I didn't need updates, not because I didn't care, but because I'd learned that constant monitoring only keeps you tethered to dynamics you're trying to outgrow. And after we hung up, I sat in my car for a while before driving home, watching the sky darken and thinking about how strange it is that success doesn't silence old voices, it amplifies them, making it even more important to decide which ones you let speak. At home, Marcus listened as I explained the invitation and the likely fallout, and he asked a simple question that cut through the noise. What do you want this event to be about? And I answered without hesitation, about the teachers, about long-term investment, about the kids who fall through cracks when attention fades, and he nodded because the answer told us everything we needed to know about how to handle the rest. In the days leading up to the dinner, work intensified in the best way, planning sessions, calls with district leaders, drafting remarks that centered impact over praise, and I found myself energized rather than drained, which was another sign of how far I'd come, because when your energy aligns with your values, effort feels different. Midway through that week, pause with me and tell me where you're watching from, because this is the part where momentum builds quietly, where old patterns try one last time to latch on before something new takes root. And if you've ever felt that moment where the past circles back just to see if you'll still open the door, you know exactly what I mean. 2 nights before the dinner, my mother sent another message, shorter this time, almost clipped, asking directly whether she should expect an invitation and whether seating arrangements included family, and I noticed the shift in tone, less pleading, more transactional, as if she were negotiating access rather than seeking connection, and I didn't respond immediately, because urgency from others doesn't require urgency from me anymore. The next morning, I replied politely and clearly that the event was professional, invitations were limited to program stakeholders, and that my attendance was in a working capacity, not a personal one, and I wished her well. And when I hit send, I felt that quiet sense of finality that comes when you state a boundary without apology. She replied within minutes, accusing me of exclusion, of deliberately cutting her out, of forgetting where I came from, and I read it once and then set the phone down, because arguments require engagement, and I wasn't interested in rehearsing a script we'd already exhausted. The dinner itself was held in a restored historic building downtown, all brick and warm light, the kind of place that signals seriousness without spectacle, and as I arrived with Marcus, greeting colleagues and donors, I felt grounded, present, aware of my purpose in that room, and when it was my turn to speak, I talked about continuity, about how programs fail when enthusiasm outpaces commitment, about how teachers need more than applause, they need resources and trust, and as I spoke, I watched faces shift from polite interest to genuine engagement, because people respond to clarity when it's rooted in lived experience. Afterward, several donors approached me with thoughtful questions, not about my background, but about implementation, about metrics, about accountability, and those conversations reaffirmed why this work mattered, because it moved beyond narrative into action. It wasn't until later that evening, as we were preparing to leave, that the ripple reached me, a colleague mentioning casually that my mother had called the program office earlier that day asking about attendance, introducing herself as my parent, and inquiring about press coverage, and instead of feeling embarrassed or angry, I felt resolved, because this was no longer a surprise, it was a pattern repeating itself, and patterns lose their power when you recognize them without reacting. On the drive home, Marcus asked how I felt, and I said honestly that I felt relieved because every time I chose alignment over appeasement, the distance between who I was and who I'd been expected to be grew clearer, and clarity is a gift even when it comes with loss. The following week brought another development, quieter but significant, an offer from the state to formalize my advisory role into a longer-term appointment, which meant influence, responsibility, and visibility, and as I reviewed the terms I thought about how my mother had once equated visibility with worth, and how differently it felt now to see it as a tool rather than a mirror. I accepted the role, knowing it would come with scrutiny, And with that acceptance came another internal decision that I would no longer preemptively manage how my family might react to my choices, because doing so only keeps them central in a story they're no longer writing. Predictably, the appointment triggered another round of outreach, not just from my mother but from extended relatives who've been quiet for years, offering congratulations layered with curiosity, probing questions about access and appearances, and I responded selectively, thanking those who spoke to me as a person rather than a conduit, and letting the rest fade into the background, because attention without relationship is just noise. One afternoon, while reviewing program data, I received a message from an old teacher friend who'd seen coverage of my appointment and wrote to say how proud she was, how she remembered me staying late to tutor kids everyone else had written off. And that message meant more to me than any public accolade, because it came from someone who'd witnessed the work before it was recognized. And I realized again that validation from the right places carries a different weight. As weeks passed, the attempts from my mother shifted again, less direct, more performative. Comments on public posts, likes on professional announcements, the digital equivalent of hovering at the edge of a frame. And instead of blocking or confronting, I maintain neutrality, because sometimes the most effective response to boundary testing is consistency. At a certain point, Rachel called to tell me my mother had been asking whether I'd consider a joint appearance at a charity event, framing it as a chance to show unity, and I laughed softly, because the irony was sharp. Unity offered only when it could be displayed, and I told Rachel gently that I wasn't interested, that unity built on erasure isn't unity at all, and Rachel understood, because she'd watched the pattern long enough to see it clearly. There was a moment not long after that, standing in my kitchen watching Lily do her homework, that I felt something settle, a sense that the cycle was finally loosening its grip, because I was no longer waiting for the next move, I was living my life without reference to it, and that's when you know you've shifted the center of gravity. The final test of that shift came unexpectedly, when a journalist reached out requesting an interview about leadership and resilience, mentioning my family story as part of the angle, and I considered it carefully, because telling your story can be empowering or exploitative depending on how it's framed, and I responded that I was open to discussing professional challenges, but not interested in revisiting personal estrangement for public consumption, and to their credit, they respected that, which reminded me that you can shape narratives by stating your terms rather than reacting to others' agendas. In the months that followed, the mentorship program launched its first cohort, teachers paired with leaders who committed not just time but advocacy, and watching those relationships form felt like watching something heal at scale, because systems reflect the values of the people who build them, and this one was being built with intention. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about my mother through Rachel, about her grappling with the limits of her influence, about moments of apparent self-reflection, and I held those reports lightly, neither hoping nor dismissing, because healing doesn't require surveillance, and if change came, it would have to stand on its own. What mattered was that my life had expanded beyond the frame she'd once set, that my work spoke louder than any justification I could offer, and that my sense of self no longer hinged on reconciliation as proof of worth. As this chapter drew toward its close, I became aware of a different kind of anticipation, not fear of confrontation, but curiosity about what comes next when you stop organizing your life around old wounds, because there's a strange emptiness that follows freedom, a space you have to learn how to fill with intention rather than habit. And that's where the story pauses for now, not in resolution, but in readiness, because the next turn wouldn't be about responding to the past, it would be about choosing the future deliberately, and that choice would ask more of me than any confrontation ever had. So stay with me, because the next moment would test not my strength against others, but my willingness to trust myself when no one else is pulling the strings anymore. The first real silence came after everything that was supposed to be loud had already happened, after the emails slowed, after the congratulatory calls tapered off, after my name stopped circulating as a talking point and returned to being just a name attached to work that needed doing. And that's when I realized how addicted my old life had been to reaction, to waiting for the next emotional tremor for my family, because without that noise there was space, and space can feel unsettling when you're not used to owning it. I woke up one morning weeks after the appointment became routine and felt something unfamiliar, not relief exactly, but steadiness, the kind that doesn't spike or crash. And I lay there thinking about how much of my adult life had been spent bracing for disappointment, preparing explanations, rehearsing defenses, and now there was nothing to brace against, just the day ahead of me, and it felt both freeing and strangely exposed. At work, the focus had shifted from symbolic wins to operational reality, budgets, staffing shortages, transportation issues, the unglamorous but critical mechanics of running a system, and I threw myself into it because meaningful work has a way of anchoring you when identity is still recalibrating. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family who once dismissed my career as insignificant would have been quick to attach themselves to these responsibilities had they been visible enough, but visibility without substance no longer tempted me. One afternoon, while reviewing reports, I received a message from a former student, now a college sophomore, thanking me for believing in her when no one else had, and I sat back in my chair and let that sink in because that message carried more weight than any public reconciliation could have. It was proof that the choice I made years ago had ripples I never needed my mother to validate. As days turned into weeks, a subtle shift occurred in how people interacted with me, fewer questions about my background, more trust in my judgment, and that shift reinforced something important, that respect earned through consistency outlasts respect borrowed through association. And yet, just when life began to feel predictably grounded, another test arrived, quieter but sharper, an invitation to a statewide panel on leadership resilience, an event with press, policymakers, and yes, families in attendance, and I paused when I read the line asking participants to bring a guest who influenced your journey, because I knew exactly how that would be interpreted by certain people if word reached them. I considered declining, not out of fear, but out of weariness, because the idea of navigating optics again felt exhausting, but then I recognized the old reflex, shrinking my presence to avoid someone else's reaction, and I refused to let that pattern resurface. I accepted the invitation and chose Marcus as my guest without hesitation, because influence isn't about origin, it's about impact, and that decision felt clean, uncomplicated. News of the panel circulated faster than I expected, and predictably, my mother reached out, not directly to me, but through a mutual acquaintance who asked whether there had been a misunderstanding, whether perhaps there was room to extend an olive branch publicly, and I listened patiently before responding that there was no misunderstanding, only a boundary, and that boundaries don't require negotiation to be valid. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, Marcus asked me if these moments still hurt, and I answered honestly that they did, but differently now, like touching an old bruise instead of an open wound. Noticeable but no longer incapacitating, and that distinction mattered because it meant I was healing rather than suppressing. Halfway through this, pause with me and tell me where you're watching from, because this is the point in the story where the conflict stops being external and starts being internal, where the real question isn't what they'll do next, but who you become when the drama no longer defines you. The panel itself was held in a modern civic center, all glass and light, and as I took my seat on stage, I scanned the audience briefly, noting familiar faces, colleagues, leaders, and yes, I saw my mother there, seated several rows back, alone, not part of any delegation, not acknowledged by anyone, and for a split second the old reflex flared, the instinct to manage the moment, to anticipate embarrassment or confrontation, but it passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, acceptance. Without engagement. When it was my turn to speak, I talked about resilience not as endurance of harm, but as the capacity to choose alignment over approval, to build systems that don't collapse when validation is withheld, and as I spoke, I wasn't speaking to her or about her. I was speaking to anyone who had been taught that loyalty requires self-erasure, and I could feel the room leaning in because that truth resonates far beyond one family. After the panel, several people approached me, thanking me for articulating something they'd struggled to name, and those conversations reaffirmed that telling the truth doesn't require naming names to be powerful. My mother did not approach me afterward, and I was grateful for that restraint, because it signaled, perhaps for the first time, an awareness that the stage was no longer hers to enter uninvited. In the days that followed, I reflected on how far the dynamic had shifted, from confrontation to coexistence at a distance, and while that might not satisfy those who crave dramatic closure, it felt authentic to me, because real change often looks anticlimactic from the outside. At home, life continued in its small, meaningful rhythms, Lily's laughter, Marcus's steady presence, dinners that didn't revolve around tension, and I noticed how my nervous system responded differently now, less hypervigilant, more at ease, and that physiological shift told me more about healing than any conversation ever could. There was still grief, of course, grief for the mother I wished I'd had, for the version of family that existed only in my imagination, but grief no longer dictated my decisions. It simply existed alongside gratitude for the life I'd built. One evening, Rachel called to tell me my mother had started volunteering at a local literacy program, and I listened without commentary because change, if genuine, doesn't need my endorsement to be real, and if it wasn't, my involvement wouldn't make it so. The most surprising realization came later, when I recognized that I no longer needed to know whether she understood what she'd done, because my peace was no longer contingent on her insight, and that was perhaps the most profound shift of all. As months passed, new challenges emerged, professional conflicts, policy debates, the inevitable friction of leadership, and I met them with a confidence that surprised even me, because when you've survived being erased by the people who are supposed to protect you, criticism from strangers loses its sting. Occasionally, someone would ask about my family in casual conversation, and I'd answer simply, honestly, without embellishment or defensiveness, and that simplicity felt like reclaiming a narrative without performing it. The last moment I'll share here happened quietly during a routine school visit, when a young teacher pulled me aside and said she'd been struggling with pressure from her parents to leave teaching for something more respectable, and she asked how I'd handle that, and I looked at her and told her the truth, that it cost me relationships, that it hurt deeply, but that choosing herself had allowed her to build a life that felt whole, and as I said it, I realized I was no longer speaking from a place of justification, but from lived certainty. That's where this chapter settles, not in triumph or tragedy, but in grounded resolve, the kind that doesn't need an audience, because the next chapter won't be about proving anything to anyone else. It will be about what happens when you finally trust your own voice enough to follow it wherever it leads. And that's a story still unfolding. So stay with me, because what comes next will test not my boundaries, but my willingness to expand beyond them. By the time the next turning point arrived, I had stopped expecting it to announce itself, because the most consequential moments in my life no longer came with raised voices or dramatic ultimatums. They arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary opportunities, and that was how I almost missed what was happening. It started with an email from a national education nonprofit asking if I would consider serving on an advisory council focused on rural school systems, a role that would require travel, media appearances, and public testimony before legislative committees, and my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was hesitation, because with visibility comes distortion, and I had already learned how quickly people rewrite your story when it benefits them. I sat with that email longer than I should have, rereading the language, weighing the cost of exposure against the value of influence, and what finally tipped the scale wasn't ambition, it was memory, the memory of being told that my work didn't matter, that it wasn't impressive enough to claim, and I realized that turning this down out of fear would be another way of letting that old judgment shape my choices. I accepted. And with that acceptance came a subtle but undeniable shift in how often my name began circulating again, not just locally, but nationally, in professional spaces that had nothing to do with my family, which made the next development both predictable and strangely surreal. I found out through Rachel, as I so often did, that my mother had started mentioning me again, selectively, carefully, to the same social circle that once pretended I didn't exist, except now the story had changed. Now I was described as always driven, clearly supported at home, a testament to strong family values, and when Rachel told me this, there was anger in her voice on my behalf, but I felt something else, a kind of detached clarity, because the pattern was unmistakable. My success was being reclaimed retroactively, not through accountability, but through narrative editing. The difference this time was that I didn't feel the urge to confront it, to correct the record, because the record that mattered most was the one I lived every day, and that record didn't require her footnote. Still, there was a reckoning building beneath the surface, because visibility creates collisions, and it was only a matter of time before paths crossed in a way that couldn't be ignored. That collision came at a regional education summit in Richmond, a multi-day event with breakout sessions, keynote speakers, and networking receptions, the kind of place my mother loved when status could be worn like a badge, and I knew she would be there because her charity had sponsored a luncheon, and for the first time, avoidance wasn't an option because I was scheduled to deliver a keynote address on the final day. The night before my speech, I barely slept, not from fear of public speaking, but from the awareness that this would be the first time we occupied the same space with equal footing, no hierarchy, no parental authority, just two adults with a shared history and very different understandings of it. The morning of the keynote, I stood backstage adjusting my notes, listening to the muffled sound of the crowd assembling, and I caught a glimpse of her through the curtain, seated near the front, posture perfect, expression composed, and I felt the old tension flicker before settling into something calmer, resolve perhaps, because I knew what I would say and what I wouldn't, and that certainty mattered. When I stepped onto the stage, the lights were bright enough that individual faces blurred, but I could feel attention sharpen, and I began not with my achievements, but with a story about a teacher who almost quit because everyone around her measured worth in salaries and titles, a teacher who stayed because she found meaning where others saw insignificance. And as I spoke, I wasn't telling my story explicitly, but anyone listening closely could hear it between the lines. About halfway through, let me pause and ask you directly, where are you watching from right now? Because this is the part of the journey where external validation stops being the prize and internal alignment becomes the real victory. And if you've ever stood at that crossroads, You know exactly what I mean. I talked about how systems fail people who don't conform to narrow definitions of success, how families, institutions, even cultures can gaslight individuals into doubting choices that are morally sound but socially inconvenient, and I saw heads nodding, saw people lean forward because these weren't abstract ideas, they were lived experiences shared by many in that room. I ended the keynote with a simple statement that leadership isn't about proximity to power, it's about proximity to impact, and the applause that followed felt different from any I'd received before, not louder, but steadier, like affirmation rather than spectacle. Backstage, as people lined up to speak with me, colleagues, educators, policymakers, I felt grounded until I sensed her presence behind me, not announced, not dramatic, just there, and when I turned, she was standing a few feet away, hands clasped, expression carefully neutral. "You spoke beautifully," she said, and the words landed without warmth or malice, simply an observation, and I thanked her politely, because politeness no longer felt like surrender, it felt like choice. She hesitated, then said she'd been telling people how proud she was, how she'd always known I'd do something meaningful, and for a moment, I considered responding with facts, timestamps, screenshots, but instead I said something simpler, something truer to who I am now. I said that pride expressed after success is easy, support offered before it is rare, and that distinction mattered to me. She looked startled, not angry, not defensive, just unprepared, because that sentence didn't invite argument. It stated reality, and after a brief silence, she nodded, said she understood, though I wasn't sure she did, and then she excused herself, retreating back into the crowd. I stood there for a moment, heart steady, realizing that the power dynamic had shifted completely, not because I'd won an argument, but because I no longer needed to have one. The rest of the summit passed without incident, but something fundamental had changed, because the illusion that my silence could be filled with whatever narrative she preferred had cracked, and from that point forward, her references to me became more cautious, less grandiose, as if she sensed that the story was no longer hers to control. In the weeks that followed, opportunities multiplied, invitations, collaborations, chances to influence policy at a level I'd never imagined, and with each step forward, I felt the distance between who I was and who I'd been told I was grow wider, and that distance felt like freedom. At home, life remained beautifully ordinary, dinners, homework, conversations about nothing and everything, and it struck me that the stability I'd built wasn't flashy, but it was resilient, not dependent on anyone's approval to stand. There were moments of sadness still, of course, moments when I wished things had been different, but those moments no longer pulled me backward. They simply reminded me of how far I'd come. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Marcus asked me if I felt finished with that chapter, with my mother, with the hurt, and I told him the truth, that chapters don't always end with a final page. Sometimes they fade into the background as the story moves on, and that felt right to me. The real reckoning wasn't confrontation, it was continuity, living well without performing reconciliation, choosing peace without pretending nothing happened, and that choice required strength of a different kind. As I prepared for the next phase of my work, more visible, more demanding, I understood that the greatest risk ahead wasn't being erased again, it was being tempted to over-explain, to justify, to reopen wounds for the sake of clarity, and I resolved not to, because clarity earned through lived consistency is far more powerful than clarity argued for. If you're still here, still listening, know this. The hunger to be seen by those who dismissed you doesn't disappear overnight, but it does lose its grip when you stop feeding it, and what comes next in the story isn't about her reaction or my response. It's about the unexpected cost of stepping fully into your own authority, because the higher you rise, the more tempting it becomes for old ghosts to resurface in new forms, and that's where the next test waits, just ahead, quieter but more complex than any before. The next phase didn't arrive with confrontation or drama, it arrived with paperwork, contracts, and decisions that forced me to confront a subtler danger than rejection, the temptation to become the very thing that once dismissed me. As my work expanded beyond county lines, as invitations came from national panels and policy groups, I noticed a quiet shift in how people spoke to me, the deference, the careful phrasing, the way doors opened before I even reached them, and if you've ever moved from overlooked to sought after, you know exactly how disorienting that can be, because power doesn't just change how others treat you. It tests who you are when no one is pushing against you anymore. I started catching myself hesitating before speaking plainly, softening opinions that once came easily, wondering if clarity might cost me access. And that frightened me more than being excluded ever did, because exclusion is visible, but self-erasure dressed up as professionalism can happen without you noticing until you're already halfway gone. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd fought so hard to escape one narrow definition of worth only to be offered another, shinier one, equally conditional, equally hungry for compliance. It was around this time that my mother reached out again, not directly, but through a mutual acquaintance who suggested a private dinner, neutral territory, no press, no audience, just a chance to clear the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger or dread. I felt calculation because I understood that timing is never accidental, and this invitation came not after remorse, but after consolidation, after my position was secure enough to be useful. I declined politely, citing a full schedule, and the response was immediate: disappointment framed as concern, concern framed as love, love framed as entitlement, and I recognized the pattern instantly, the same one I'd studied in classrooms and boardrooms alike. When someone feels control slipping, they reach for sentiment. What surprised me was not her persistence, but my own lack of urgency, because the need to resolve unfinished emotional business had faded, replaced by something steadier: discernment. At work, I was facing a different kind of test, a proposed partnership with a well-funded organization whose values sounded impressive on paper, but whose implementation history told a different story, one that prioritized optics over outcomes, and I was expected to endorse it publicly, to lend my credibility to a model I knew would fail the very students it claimed to serve. Old instincts flared, the instinct to compromise quietly, to stay agreeable, to avoid becoming inconvenient. And then I remembered the folding table at Thanksgiving, the scarf in the closet, the WhatsApp message that erased me, and I understood that the cost of silence is cumulative. It doesn't disappear just because the stakes are higher. I declined the partnership publicly, clearly, without theatrics, and the backlash was swift. Emails questioning my judgment, whispers about whether I was difficult, the familiar language used to discipline anyone who refuses to perform gratitude for a seat they earned. But something else happened too. Teachers reached out privately to thank me. Parents sent letters describing how often they'd watched initiatives fail because no one at the top was willing to say no, and I realized that integrity doesn't always attract applause, but it builds trust, and trust lasts longer than approval. Halfway through all of this, let me pause and ask you, where are you watching from right now? Because this is the point in the story where the external conflict matters less than the internal recalibration, the moment when you decide whether success will reshape you or reveal you. And if you've ever felt that tension, you're not alone. At home, Marcus noticed the strain before I did, the way I carry conversations into silence, the way my mind stayed half at work even during laughter, and one night he asked me a question that cut through everything. He asked whether I was still running from the old wound or finally standing somewhere new. I didn't answer right away because the truth was complicated. Growth doesn't erase old injuries, it reframes them, and sometimes the urge to prove yourself sneaks back in disguised as responsibility. Lily, in her quiet perceptiveness, offered clarity in a way only a child can, when she asked why some people on TV talked about helping kids but never listened to them, and in that moment I understood that the lesson I was teaching extended beyond policy or leadership. It lived in daily choices, in what I modeled when pressure mounted. I began to slow down, to choose depth over breadth, to say no more often, not from fear, but from alignment, and that shift created space where reflection could catch up with momentum. It was in that space that I finally read my mother's letter again, not with the ache of old longing, but with analytical distance, noticing what it contained and what it didn't, acknowledgement without repair, regret without responsibility, and I felt compassion without obligation, which is a difficult balance to hold, but a necessary one. I realized then that closure isn't something someone gives you, it's something you construct from truth and boundaries, and mine didn't require another conversation. It required consistency. As my visibility increased, so did attempts to associate, invitations that hinted at reconciliation without naming harm, and each time I declined without explanation, not out of spite, but because my life no longer had room for unresolved dynamics masquerading as progress. Professionally, the risks continued, a funding review that hinged on political favor, a policy stance that would cost short-term support but protect long-term outcomes, and each decision reinforced the same lesson, that leadership built on self-respect is quieter, but sturdier than leadership built on appeasement. There were nights I lay awake wondering how differently things might have unfolded if I'd chosen the easier path, if I'd smoothed edges, accepted symbolic gestures, played the role expected of me. But those thoughts passed quickly now, because the life I'd built didn't feel fragile, it felt rooted. The real surprise came not from my mother or my siblings, but from myself, from the realization that I no longer rehearsed imaginary conversations with them, no longer measured milestones against their potential reactions, no longer needed them as an audience for my becoming. When a journalist asked me in an interview what motivated my work, I spoke about students, about equity, about the quiet heroism of educators, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to contextualize my past, to explain where I came from because my present was sufficient. Still, the story wasn't finished, because growth invites new challenges, and the more visible your values become, the more resistance they attract, sometimes from unexpected places, sometimes wrapped in praise. And just as I settled into this new equilibrium, a development emerged that threatened to test every boundary I'd built, not through rejection, but through appropriation. A move so calculated and so public that ignoring it would no longer be an option, and navigating it would require not just strength, but precision, because the next chapter wouldn't be about proving worth or protecting peace. It would be about defining legacy, and once legacy enters the room, the stakes change entirely. What finally forced everything into focus wasn't another message from my mother or a headline with my name in it. It was a quiet meeting request that landed in my calendar with language so carefully neutral it almost fooled me. A community legacy discussion, hosted by a foundation whose board I recognized immediately. The same social circle that had once treated my existence like an inconvenience, now wanting to discuss the future of education with me as its centerpiece. And the reason this mattered wasn't ego or revenge, it was clarity, because legacy is the last place people hide when power stops working the old way. I walked into that room knowing exactly what was coming, the compliments disguised as reconciliation, the praise that never names harm, the subtle rewriting of history that turns absence into oversight and cruelty into misunderstanding. And as I listened, I realized something unsettling. They weren't asking for my forgiveness. They were asking for my silence in exchange for symbolic inclusion, the final upgrade from exile to ornament. The proposal was elegant: a scholarship fund bearing my name, a photo op, a few speaking engagements, my story softened just enough to inspire without indicting anyone. And if you've ever watched people try to turn your survival into their redemption, you know how seductive that offer can sound on the surface. I didn't answer right away because the real decision wasn't about money or visibility. It was about whether I would allow my story to be edited by the same values that once tried to erase it. Halfway through that meeting, as they spoke about bridging generations and healing narratives, I asked a single question that shifted the air in the room. I asked who would be on the decision committee, and when the answer included names that had never once stood up for me when it mattered, the truth snapped into place. This wasn't about change, it was about control. I thanked them for their interest and told them I'd be launching something of my own, something smaller, quieter, harder to brand, a teacher-led initiative with no donors on the board and no legacy names attached, and the disappointment that followed confirmed everything I needed to know. In the days that followed, speculation swirled, calls went unanswered, doors that had opened easily now closed politely, and for the first time, I felt the weight of choosing principle over expansion, because growth always punishes refusal before it rewards integrity. Let me pause here and ask you something directly. Where are you watching from right now? Because this is the moment where many people fold, the moment when comfort tempts you to compromise your own story. And if you've ever stood at that crossroads, you know how lonely it can feel. What surprised me was how little loneliness I actually felt, because the life I'd built was no longer dependent on external validation. Marcus didn't flinch when I told him what I'd done. Lily didn't ask why we weren't on TV. My colleagues didn't withdraw. They leaned in. And that's when I understood that the fear of losing support is often louder than the reality. The initiative grew slowly, deliberately, teacher by teacher, classroom by classroom, without press releases or galas, and its impact wasn't flashy, but it was real. Literacy scores rose, retention improved, mentorship took root, and every success felt earned instead of staged. Months later, a final attempt came from my mother, not dramatic, not public, just a voicemail that said she wanted to attend one of our programs, to sit quietly in the back, no introductions, no speeches, and I sat with that request longer than any other, because this time it didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like curiosity mixed with regret. I didn't say yes and I didn't say no. I told her the program was open to the public and left it at that, because access without entitlement is the only kind that means anything. She never came, and I don't know why, but I stopped needing to know, because healing isn't measured by other people's transformations, it's measured by your own stability. The longer I lived this way, the more I saw the pattern everywhere: families, workplaces, institutions that confuse loyalty with obedience and love with performance, and the moral lesson I wish someone had given me earlier is simple but uncomfortable. You don't owe access to people who only value you when you're useful, even if they share your blood, even if the world tells you you should. The real closure arrived quietly one evening when Lily asked me to help her with a school project about role models, and she listed teachers, friends, neighbors, people who showed up, and when I asked if she wanted to include grandparents, she thought for a moment and said no. not with sadness, just clarity, and in that moment I realized the cycle had already broken. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this: betrayal doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like conditional pride, and the bravest thing you can do is refuse to audition for love. If this resonated with you, if you've ever been asked to shrink, to smooth over harm, to make peace at the cost of yourself, I want you to say it out loud in the comments, because naming it is how you reclaim it. And when you're done here, there's another story waiting for you that goes even deeper into what happens when people mistake your silence for consent, and you'll want to hear that one next.